Okay, well, I'm going to get us started. My name is Lindsay. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the program assistant here at Earth Ministry, Washington Interfaith Power and Light. And we like to start our events here at Earth Ministry WAIPL with land acknowledgements and take these land acknowledgements seriously. We are located within the unceded territories of Northwest Native Nations. Our office is on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past, present, and future. Land acknowledgement is one way to resist erasure of Indigenous histories, as well as to honor tribes and the land itself. And you can put in the chat the native lands that you are on today as you join us. This teach-in is an educational forum that aims to begin community engagement and education on climate and environmental justice, involving in 1,000 communities in person and online in a one-day worldwide event put on by Bard University and the Open Society University Network. And due to the nature of this teach-in, this is going to be a lot more educational content and us talking than a lot of you might be used to at our Earth Ministry WAIPL events. So please put all of your questions in the chat and I will answer them as I'm able as the event goes on. And I am going to go ahead and turn over the mic to my colleagues and we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. So I am Shakia. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the multi-faith program manager. And the next thing we're going to see is a little introduction video. If Maddie, if you can hit the next slide.
Uh-oh.
Oh, we're missing the audio.
Okay.
I think you'll have to turn your audio on, Maddie, I believe.
Just a second, I'll fix that. That pesky box you gotta click that says share sound.
Just an excuse for us to get to see each other all on gallery view.
Okay. Second time's the charm.
Okay. Welcome to the worldwide teach-in on climate and justice.
Bienvenue à la conférence mondiale éducative sur le climat et la justice.
Bem-vindo ao encontro participativo global sobre clima e justiça.
Today, we are coming together globally to share our concern for the climate crisis, for climate justice, and to find solutions. We understand that carbon pollution is causing the planet to heat up. We see the fires and floods, the droughts and crop failures. This teach-in will help us all move from despair about this to determination together to change the future. Why climate and justice? Global warming is profoundly unjust. People in low-income communities are already suffering the most as the planet heats up. In the last year, tens of millions of people have been forced to leave their homes by climate change, more refugees than from conflict and violence combined. We can stop this. We can stabilize the climate, and in doing so, create jobs and opportunities for all in a new green economy. What will it take? Our hard work and the courage to face it.
It's not really that bad.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Climate change, it's pretty close to home for South Carolina.
From the UK's wettest February on record to raging wildfires in California.
These winds died down. This fire is unstoppable.
Ferocious fires scorch terrain as Earth
Water
heats.
shortages forcing more than 13 million people to have to boil their water before they can use it. Marcus Moore.
It can take air out of my little brother's lungs.
What if it submerges my Bangladeshi land of love, magic, stories, and songs?
I'm afraid my hands can do nothing to stop the downpour.
I'm afraid it will leave us alone in a world of concrete and plastic.
Groom Gaia into a vacant void.
It will take the green and leave us in the dark.
I'm afraid it will bring out the worst in people.
Uprooting our families and communities.
Leaving our children to an irreversible nightmare.
Taking the beauty of each season from us.
Causing untold suffering that could have been prevented.
I am afraid.
I'm afraid.
I'm afraid.
I'm afraid.
I'm afraid.
I'm afraid. What are we being taught?
What are they teaching us?
Economics, literature, math, engineering, history, music.
What meaning do they hold if our climate swallows us whole?
I can be courageous.
I can be courageous.
I can use my voice and passion, keep fighting even on the days it feels hopeless.
I can fight for my people.
I can hold on to the beauty we still have.
I can save our land against this man-made havoc.
I can be a voice for the sky, the soil, and the sea.
I can make a good future for our next generation.
I can stand up, even when it feels easier to sit down.
I can love my brothers and sisters and protect their lives, because we have the same mother, the great Mother Earth.
I can be louder than polluters that try to silence life.
I can do my part and leave others around me to do better.
I can ask my teacher to make climate.
I can ask my teacher to make climate a class.
Make climate a class.
To make climate a class.
Make climate a class.
Okay, and next slide, please. Okay, so that video, as you saw, very emotional, very uplifting. A lot of the people involved in this are at universities, high schools, middle schools, and I want to say elementary as well, but they also invite other institutions and religious institutions or organizations to also be involved with this. Now, this is our community introduction to the topic of environmental justice. It is a topic with a lot of nuance and diverse experiences, and this workshop is meant to be introductory, and it is not going to encapsulate every environmental injustice in Washington state. But here are our objectives. So first is we understand the foundation of environmental justice. The second is that we see how pollution or disruptive agricultural practices disproportionately affect people experiencing poverty and members of racial and ethnic minorities. We will explore why people experiencing poverty and members of racial and ethnic minorities are often exposed to more pollution than others. We are going to link pollution and disruptive agricultural practices to inequality. We will be looking at areas of Washington state to see how environmental discrimination impacts different categories of people. And we are going to understand how people of faith play a role in working for environmental justice historically and in the present. Maddie, could you do the next slide, please? So first up, what is environmental justice? Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This goal will be achieved when everyone enjoys the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, and everyone has equal access to the decision-making process to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work. Through a faith lens, environmental justice can be considered a central component of the beloved community articulated by Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. Next slide, please. Now, the faith community was the first to name the experience of disproportionate pollution as environmental racism. This comes out of UCC's Commission for Racial Justice Landmark 1987 report, Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States. In 1982, the state of North Carolina chose a poor, predominantly African American community for the placement of a toxic waste landfill to dispose of PCBs illegally dumping along the roadway of 14 counties. Residents of Warren County, North Carolina, enlisted the support of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice to engage in a campaign of nonviolent civil disobedience. In response to this experience and from others across the nation, the CRJ commissioned a study to examine what was perceived at the time to be intentional placement of hazardous waste sites, landfills, incinerators, and polluting industries in communities inhabited mainly by African Americans, Hispanic or Latina people, Native Americans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders, from workers and the working poor. These groups were and still are particularly vulnerable because they are perceived as weak and passive citizens who will not fight back against the poisoning of their neighborhoods in fear that it may jeopardize jobs and economic survival. In releasing the findings of the 1987 study written by Charles Lee, the Reverend Benjamin Chavez, CRJ Executive Director referred to intentionally selecting communities of color for waste disposal sites and polluting industrial facilities, essentially condemning them to contamination. And they referred to this as environmental racism. He called on the United Church of Christ to be a champion working for environmental justice across the nation and across the world. Next slide, please. So this report was extensive and it was prophetic and ushered in more widespread awareness of the depth of racism within environmental pollution. Today, the Washington Environmental Task Force is working to create an equitable society wherein marginalized communities also have access to environmentally safe livelihoods. Though those of us in King County have our fair share of issues when it comes to environmental injustices, such as the fact that life expectancy between North and South King County is a difference of 10 years, North King County being the one who faces less disadvantages. Earth Ministry, Washington Interfaith Power and Light, is a statewide organization. And for the purpose of this presentation, we will focus on other counties across the state. Namely, we will look at Pierce, Benton, Grant, Franklin, Yakima, and Whatcom counties, who all face different hazards to life for the diverse populations that live there. We will also be using a couple of existing environmental justice campaigns that Earth Ministry WAIPL community are supporting, and we will take a look more in depth at how environmental injustice manifests in different regions of our state, as well as taking a look at an area of environmental justice that we do not have a campaign in, but look to our coalition partners for guidance on. Before we get to that, we were going to look at the Environmental Justice Task Force and their operating principles. If we can go to the next slide, please. So they operate on these principles here. First is you embrace equity. And that is you're using equity to strive for fairness and justice to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to meet their full potential. Equity is not equality. The second is that we do focus on racism, or they do focus on racism. And they do this by promoting equity for all historically marginalized communities. And there are different forms of discrimination and oppression related to each other, whether it is at, your LGBTQ community, women, people who have limited English proficiency, low income or limited wealth, people with disabilities, that all of that needs to be taken into account when we look at this. The third thing is centering community. So this can only be achieved when we're talking about equity if the community is suffering from the inequities where they live and work have a voice. So they have a say in how they want their community to be helped, or if they want their community to be helped, because they know more than any outsider would. And then they commit to bold action. So these inequities exist because of racism, economic injustice, and systemic oppression that hinder opportunities for individuals and communities to thrive. In order to eliminate all of these injustices, you have to take bold action to make bold change. And then they're going to be vigilant for unintended consequences. So policy, program, and budget decisions can have adverse unintended consequences. And they need to do their best to try and avoid that as they do the work that they are doing. If we could get to the next slide. And here is a page where we have different Washington environmental justice nonprofits who are all great resources, and they all provide something unique to the community of everyone in Washington. So Puget Sound Sage, they have been on the forefront of driving some of the nation's most dynamic policies for climate, economic, and racial justice for over a decade. We have La Resistencia, a grassroots organization based in Washington, and they're working to end the detention of immigrants and to stop deportations. There is Front and Center, a coalition seeking just transition away from an extraction-based economy to one centered on ecological restoration, community resilience, and social equity. Then there is Got Green, and they fight for transformative change by building community power in South Seattle. And Community to Community, this is a woman-led grassroots organization dedicated to food sovereignty and immigration rights. We have Native Daily Network. They exist to help overcome Indigenous invisibility and to amplify Indigenous causes through media. And then Sacred Sea, which is an Indigenous-led nonprofit that is committed to promoting ancestral knowledge and practices for the protection and revitalization of the waters, culture, life, and sacred sites of the Salish Sea. So that is a great resource, every one of them, if you want to take a screenshot. They're all doing incredible work and working in different areas that Earth Ministry, WAIPL, we do not touch on everything, so they are a good place to look towards. And then the next slide. So we are going to start off with fossil fuels in Pierce County, and Maddie is going to be the one to lead us through this.
Yeah, thanks, Kia, for that great introduction. Hi, everyone. I'm Maddie. My pronouns are they, them, and I am Earth Ministry's operations manager, but because we're so small, I also get a chance to do some campaign and advocacy work and have done quite a bit of our work in Pierce County, especially around fossil fuels on the Tacoma tide flats. And of course, we could talk about fossil fuels all around the state. But just today for the focus, we're just going to focus on a little bit here, knowing that we won't be able to cover everything, and that I've done whole workshops on Pierce County, so this will just be a little taste. In Pierce County, the Puyallup tribe is there, as well as the Muckleshoot tribe, and then Steilacoom and Coast Salish peoples as well. So here's sort of three things in my mind that are coming together to create substantial environmental injustice in Pierce County, specifically around fossil fuels. So in Tacoma specifically, there's a concentration of toxic or fossil fuel facilities and legacy pollution in the Port of Tacoma. We're also dealing with blatant disregard of tribal treaty rights for the Puyallup tribe, and then planet warming greenhouse gas emissions that lead to local and global climate injustice. So kind of all those three things work together to create environmental injustice in Tacoma. I'm going to spend some time talking about things that are currently going on, and like new pollution and new issues with fossil fuels, but also just wanted to remind folks or share with folks that there's a long legacy of toxic pollution in Tacoma from many different industries and sites, but I think the biggest one that people sometimes know about is the Asarco smelter that created a lead and arsenic plume over a large part of the South Sound. And this is a map that sort of shows where the arsenic levels are highest, and they've actually done a lot of work to you know, essentially scoop out and replace people's soil in their yards in specific parts of Tacoma. I remember watching PBS Kids as a kid, and after every show there'd be the dirt alert commercial that was like, don't eat dirt on the playground because it's probably toxic because of the arsenic plume from Asarco. So that's sort of some context for what folks in Tacoma are dealing with still on top of this long history of exploitation and pollution. So here is just a couple of the things that are pretty concrete examples of environmental injustice today on top of, you know, dealing with legacy pollution. Earth Ministry has talked quite a bit about the construction of Puget Sound Energy's Tacoma liquefied natural gas facility on the Tacoma Tide Flats. And this has, you know, been a long time campaign for a couple of years with widespread community outrage against this facility. And it was constructed without the Puyallup tribe's consent and on their ancestral lands and waters. On top of that, there's also ongoing proposed expansion of other fossil fuel facilities on the Tacoma Tide Flats. The Port of Tacoma is home to several pretty large fossil fuel facilities that want to expand and create even more pollution. And then because of all these facilities that are located there, there's both air quality issues and pollution exposure for local residents and communities and workers. I can't tell you the number of online Tacoma City Council hearings I've been on where somebody, you know, calls in from Northeast Tacoma and says, I had an asthma attack last week because of all the pollution that was emitted from this facility and nothing happened. And like, this is a pattern that keeps happening over and over to folks that live there and are dealing with air quality issues. And then on top of that, the Northwest Detention Center, which is a for-profit immigration prison, is located in the industrial Tide Flats and right near a Superfund site and near these fossil fuel facilities that we're talking about. I mean, there's a reason this isn't zoned residential and those folks are forced to live there. So I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about Tacoma LNG. I could talk about it for hours, but we don't have that. So I'll just touch on sort of the basics and where we're at right now. And so liquefied natural gas is made from fracked gas, made by pressurizing fracked gas. And the Puyallup, for several years now, the Tacoma community and the Puyallup tribe have raised significant concerns, not only about climate pollution from, you know, building another fossil fuel facility that we'll be forced to rely on for decades, but also serious safety concerns about putting, you know, a highly pressurized fossil fuel facility right in the center of a large city. There's also issues with like if there were pollution released, like with salmon and the Puget Sound and the, you know, all the animals that live there. And then I think the biggest issue and one that we've tried to elevate and folks are talking about is the issue of treaty rights, which my colleague Jess is going to go into more detail later and about how that's an environmental injustice. But this facility was essentially built on the Puyallup tribe's ancestral land, and it's the only reason it's not part of their reservation is because it wasn't land when the treaty was signed. So it's like a little loophole that allowed them to build this right essentially next to the reservation, but on their ancestral waters. And the tribe has said no repeatedly for years, and they built it anyway, and there's still a long ongoing fight with it. Yeah, there's a lot more I could say there, but I'll just leave it at that. And the big problem, one of the big problems is that LNG is not the clean bridge fuel that some people would have us think. You know, there's a lot of pollution that happens in communities where fracking takes place, not just in Tacoma, where this gas would be made into LNG. And then, you know, there's the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women in places where there is a lot of fossil fuel extraction because of the numbers of workers that go there. And so that is all connected to this issue of Tacoma LNG. There's a map here on this slide that the Puyallup tribe made that shows, I think it shows the census tracts and the number of people that live in those different sectioned off areas. And then there was some studies done about safety concerns with Tacoma LNG and like what would happen if there was an explosion, etc. There's an LNG facility along sort of near the Columbia River in Washington that exploded several years ago. It may have been 5 or 6 years ago, but at this point, and it was a very large explosion, and luckily no one was hurt because it was in a pretty remote area and it's a much smaller facility than what Puget Sound Energy has built. And so this map was created to like show people like how many people really live this close to such a dangerous facility. And they've said, oh, it's safe, but there hasn't really been clear evidence or understanding that that's the case. There's also another version of this map that shows all of the schools and daycare centers within the so-called blast zone. And then this, I don't know if you can see, but this green line is the Puyallup Tribe's reservation. And so there's a lot of Indigenous folks and tribal members that live right there within the blast zone because it's being built on their land, essentially. So where we're at as of now is the facility has been built. It's not fully operational yet because they don't have customers. They have customers lined up, but they haven't converted their ships to run on LNG yet. And so what's happened is the Puyallup Tribe, along with some community partners, have appealed the LNG clean air permit twice. They lost the first appeal and then appealed that appeal, and that's still in the courts right now. And so it's been a long fight, and it's kind of just a waiting game right now. I really love this picture down here on the left. It's from our friends at 350 Tacoma of a climate strike march in Tacoma a couple of years ago that was led by Puyallup tribal water warriors and clearly had a focus on Tacoma LNG because of the fight that the community has gone through. And Earth Ministry, WAIPL, and the faith community, we're going to continue to support the tribe and fight against Tacoma LNG, you know, where it's helpful and as it makes sense. We collected some photo petitions from faith communities across the state. Here's a really good one from someone who goes to a congregation in Port Townsend. They made this like beautiful sign after, you know, learning some more about Tacoma LNG. And then last, I'd really encourage, if you want to know more about Tacoma LNG, please go watch this documentary film. It's called Ancestral Waters. It's made by our partners at Native Daily Network, who Kia shared a little bit about. They're a nonprofit, and they are making this film available to everyone for free because they just want people to learn about it and watch it. And so you can go to their website, nativedailynetwork.org, and you can actually watch the film there. And it's about the Puyallup tribe's fight against Tacoma LNG and really focuses on the treaty rights issue. It'll really get you fired up. I highly recommend it. Yeah, and please go check out Native Daily Network's website, read some of their content and their work. beside the ancestral waters, and they've done a phenomenal, amazing job of telling the story from an Indigenous perspective of this Tacoma LNG fight. And it's not over, and we will keep folks informed. Really quickly, I want to talk about fossil fuel expansion, because Tacoma LNG is not the only facility in Tacoma. So right now, very exciting, brand new fossil fuel facilities are banned in Tacoma, which is amazing and involved a lot of work by advocates over many years. So the Tacoma City Council has banned construction of new facilities since 2017-ish. For a while, those were temporary protections, and now they're slightly more semi-permanent. Some expansion is still allowed. We helped pass non-interim regulations in November 2021, which stopped some types of fossil fuel facility expansion, but left room for certain types of expansion. It was complicated. There's some loopholes, and we're still fighting for stronger protections. And where that sort of comes in is where folks can potentially get involved in the next 6 months to a year, is the more permanent sub-area planning process is starting to ramp up. Right now, they're talking about the planning of the planning. So it may be a couple months before there's opportunities for public input, but this is a really exciting time and an opportunity to re-envision and dream about what the future of the Tacoma Tide Flats could be and what the land use there should be. And lastly, I just want to talk a little bit about the Northwest Detention Center, which is located on the Tide Flats amongst all of these industrial facilities and businesses in the port. They're actually located right next to a Superfund site. There's a metal, I don't know if you can see this, but like right next to it, there's an old metal recycling facility that actually a few years ago had some lithium-ion batteries catch fire, and so there was a big fire there, and a lot of the detainees were breathing in that air from the fire, and there really wasn't anything done about it. So just one of the risks and environmental injustices those folks are facing. Here, I love this picture. It's from La Resistencia. They are actually a member of the Power Past Fracked Gas Coalition that we are a member of, because they so clearly see the connection between the injustice of immigrants being detained on the Tide Flats and near toxic facilities and the construction of this new dangerous Tacoma LNG facility. And here's a quote from, there was a recent article published in High Country News about the Tacoma LNG facility and the fight against it, and they interviewed folks from La Resistencia talking about how the immigrant detainees were affected by living in essentially an industrial place with toxic facilities. The poor air quality means that Ivan Sanchez, who is detained at the facility, has to use an inhaler. He said air filtration isn't properly maintained and the bad air comes and goes. The drinking water is often brown and doesn't taste right, he added, and bottled water costs detainees $2 a bottle. So on top of all of this, they want to expand fossil fuels and build new facilities like Tacoma LNG right next to where these folks are forced to live. So what would justice look like for these communities and for us? So, and we could probably spend a whole hour brainstorming and thinking, envisioning and dreaming about what justice could look like here, but here's just a few things that, folks have said and shared clearly over and over in Tacoma. So justice would look like a just transition away from fossil fuels and polluting industries in Tacoma, including stopping the Tacoma LNG facility and other fossil fuel facilities expansion. Clean air and water for all community members, including folks incarcerated at the Northwest Detention Center. And then ultimately meaningful consultation with the Puyallup tribe on fossil fuels and land use. And Jessica will talk a bit more about this later, but meaningful consultation isn't just asking the tribe what they want and checking a box, but like actually listening and building relationships, etc. So there's a whole lot more we could say about that Jessica will touch on a little bit later. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague Kia. Yeah, I know that was quick and there's a lot more to say, but we also want to get to talk about some of the other places in Washington.
Okay, thank you. So when I was first speaking, I talked about us introducing a topic that Earth Ministry WAIPL hasn't done a lot of advocacy on. So it's going to look a little different, and it is brand new introduction to, something I have a great interest in and am very enthusiastic about, and I want to introduce our community to, and that is agriculture. And in doing so, we're going to focus on 4 different counties, but they're all right next to each other. So we have Franklin, Benton, Grant, and Yakima counties, the indigenous territories of the Cayuse, Umatilla, Walla Walla, and Yakima tribes. And you can see which one they're in. Next slide, please. Okay, starting with the overall landscape of agriculture in the United States. 2.5 million farm workers in the United States form the backbone of the food system that we all take part of, but they also comprise one of the nation's most disenfranchised groups of workers. From slavery to the Bracero program, the story of US agriculture is a story of exploitation. Next slide, please. So a couple of facts: 85% of our fruits and vegetables are hand harvested. That is incredibly intensive work that these people are doing. The agriculture is a $200+ billion industry, and farm workers are needed to make it a profitable industry. Yet, farm workers have long hours, low wages, and suffer from heat stress and pesticide use in the fields. They are often isolated and excluded from laws protecting other workers, and they are treated as if they are machines in the field. And they have to rely on concerned consumers and under-resourced advocacy nonprofits like Community to Community to achieve justice in the fields. Next slide, please. The United States agriculture system has always depended on the oppression of mostly foreign-born people for cheap or free labor. There is an estimated 70% of hired farm workers who are undocumented immigrants. 75% of agricultural workers are foreign-born, 69% of which are from Mexico, and 77% of these workers, out of the whole 100, have reported that they are most comfortable speaking in Spanish. So there's only 29% who say that they speak well, 41 who say a little or somewhat. And that means any material or help they are getting may not be in a language that they can understand or work well with. Next slide, please. A few more facts. So I said 75% are foreign born. About 30% of farm worker families live below the poverty line. And farm workers are 35 times more likely to die from heat than other workers. And so I've mentioned 2 big factors that they have to face, which is having to deal with wildfires and smoke, as well as heat. And that is what a large portion of, well, the whole portion of my presentation is going to be about. Next slide, please. Okay, so here are some stats for our state's agriculture. We have a 10.6 billion market value, and that includes crops and livestock. Over 300 crops are grown in Washington. Apples alone have a value of 2.4 billion, And 6.4 billion of our total agriculture, everything we do, is exported annually to other states, and oftentimes with Washington, most of it is going to other countries. Okay, next slide, please. And so here's a breakdown of the counties we're going to be talking about. So Franklin, I noted two different populations in these counties, the Hispanic or Latina population and Native populations. So Franklin, 54.2% are Hispanic or Latina, with 0.5 being Native. And something exciting about this county is that it is the first in the Pacific Northwest to have a majority of the whole county be of Hispanic or Latina heritage. Then we have Benton County. Oh, sorry, for Franklin also, agriculture is the second largest industry in the county. With Benton, we have 23.8% being Hispanic or Latina, with 0.6 being Native. And for them, agriculture is 8th in industry for where they get most of their profits. Grant County, 42.8% Hispanic or Latina, with 0.8% being Native. Agriculture is their #1 industry. And then Yakima with 50.7% Hispanic or Latina, and 3.6 being Native, and agriculture is also their #1 industry. Next slide, please. So those stats are important because farm workers don't travel far to get where they're working. They live near the farms where they're at. And you can see that reflected in the county demographics, but also it's important to take account who's doing the work, where they live, and what is happening where they are. So we are unfortunately becoming very used to wildfires. As you can see, in 2019, it was 169,742 acres that were burned. In 2020, it jumped up to 842,358 acres that were burned. And then in 2021, 674,249. And this is only going to stay high, most likely, because as temperatures rise and the soil dries out, there's going to just be an increase in wildfire activity, whether it is from natural sources like lightning striking or human sources. So if someone happens to light a fire and it unfortunately just catches and cannot be contained. Next slide, please. First up, we're going to be looking at the wildfire portion of everything. So when I was talking earlier just about, how many workers suffer from the effects of working in this heat, you also have smoke and wildfires containing chemicals, gases, and fine particles. And that reduces lung function, it worsens asthma and other lung conditions, and it worsens heart conditions. Each of these health risks is also compounded exponentially by socioeconomic factors. So that could be lack of immigration status, fear of going to authority and having their immigration status being held against them. There's the general criminalization of immigrants. So again, the fear of coming forward for assistance, the threat of being separated from families. And then you have the fact that a lot of information is not provided in their spoken language. So you saw how large the Latina community in these counties are. Farm owners know this. They know the level of comfort their workers have with English language. And even so, they tend to only post things in English, which makes it really inaccessible for people who are most comfortable or only know Spanish to get the help that they need. And then you have the fact that most farm workers do not have paid leave, and they are not eligible for unemployment, which leaves them vulnerable economically. When it comes to working on a farm, they are not paid by the hour. They are paid by piece. So how many cherries do you harvest? How many apples are you able to pick, like the weight of them? So time spent away from the job results in income loss. And the fact that they get paid by piece and not hour means that working in hazardous conditions like smoke and heat is encouraged because they can lose their income. And then again, the lack of documents or notice of rights, etc., that are in their spoken language. If we could go to the next slide, please. Here is a quote from Dominique Damien, who is the safety director of the Washington State Farm Bureau, where she said, "Right now, we have not seen how wildfire smoke affects people in the workforce more so than people not in the workforce," which that quote alone is ridiculous, because us not on farms, in homes, we are greatly impacted by the hazardous conditions that wildfire smoke causes. So of course, people who are out in the field and their employers are not even required until it's too late to provide masks or breaks or shade or anything. Of course, they are going to be affected a lot more than we would. And she went on to say that more stringent protections just aren't necessary. Unfortunately, Washington's approach is largely reactive. The labor and industry, they will investigate, but they only investigate once a complaint is filed. And then you have the fact that most workers are afraid to report their employer to the state for reasons I mentioned above, being separated, their immigration status coming into question, and things like that. Next slide, please. So heat is the leading weather-related killer in the United States, and even more lethal to farm workers who are working under the hot sun for long hours. And then just that little statistic, between 1992 and 2016, more than 780 workers across the country have been killed, and 70,000 have been seriously injured. So again, unfortunately, these are only the reported cases, since many do not seek the medical care that they need or might not realize just how impactful working in the heat is. So heat exposure symptoms can be headaches, nausea, dizziness, muscle cramps, weakness, irritability, confusion, slurred speech. Too much heat can lead to seizures and loss of consciousness. So if you have all those and then they're left untreated, it actually can progress into acute kidney injuries and heat strokes, or exacerbate other health problems such as asthma and heart disease. Unfortunately, as climate change accelerates, worker injuries such as those above, as well as death, are projected to increase in the coming years. Next slide, please. The solution is very simple. It is water, shade, rest. The hindrance is that employers in Washington State do not voluntarily provide these. So again, farm workers are paid by piece, which discourages them from taking these breaks or stopping to hydrate. Agricultural workers die of heat stroke at a rate of nearly 20 times greater than all US civilian workers, and that is according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Washington State, on average, has 55 workers' compensation claims each year for heat-related illnesses, most in the agricultural sector, according to statistics kept by the State Department of Labor and Industries. Next slide, please. So extreme heat can cause permanent disabilities and death as a result of heat stroke or by aggravating cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. And then I already said that the claim portion of 55 per year, most agriculture. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, in our heat wave in 2021, Florencio Guetta Vargas, known to his family as Jose Cortez Avila, worked on a hops farm in Yakima. And he was one of the 95 people who died last summer in the heat wave. That 95 was the total for Washington. Now, this was around the time Washington did implement emergency rules to protect farm workers. And unfortunately, our rules do not go into effect until the weather is at 100, which is incredibly high already. When deputies arrived on the scene at 2 p.m., it was 97 degrees. But according to AgWeatherNet, and that's a website that farmers or like climate researchers use, the temperature was 100.8 at 2 p.m. when they were on the scene after he passed out and then eventually died. And then state regulators did investigate the death, and it was ruled to be because of heat. And now the farm owner is under investigation for, did he actually follow the heat requirements that he is required to or not. Next slide, please. So here is some of the protections that our emergency order has. So a paid 10-minute break every 2 hours when it's 100 degrees. But again, they're not paid hourly, they're paid by piece. So every moment not working is loss of income in their livelihood. And it's not a well-paying industry as it is. So you have to have paid cool drinking water breaks at 89 degrees. And then you have to have written outdoor heat exposure safety training, which is great, but there's no language requirement. So if 80+% of your workers do not speak English, and the farm owners decide, their language is English, they're going to post this, these workers are not going to know what to do or what protections that they have. Unfortunately, we are behind our West Coast cohort. So in Oregon, they have the same type of protections. So shade and water must be provided, but that is when the index is at 80. So theirs kicks into effect a lot cooler. And then extra protections are implemented at 90 degrees, including a shaded area to cool down, and then the same 10-minute rest breaks every 2 hours. California does the same, but it's a 95. Now, unlike Oregon, Washington does not consider what it feels like outside. So like, including humidity, which would kick in these protections at a much lower temperature. So, you have your temperature and then, but actually feels like. Oregon kicks everything in at the feels like, because it takes into account where the sun is at, what time of day, what the humidity is, and other conditions. And even though they have these protections, in law, the agriculture industry is notorious for not complying with labor standards or workers' rights. And then Washington is second only to California when it comes to producing labor-intensive crops, such as apples, asparagus, hops, and berries. So our protections don't kick in until it's way hotter. Not everything about temperature and weather is considered, and we have very labor-intensive crops that's going to, kick up someone's body heat even more than other states might. And then there's a quote from Elizabeth Strader of the United Farm Workers Labor Union saying, the reality is that at 89 degrees, you are already getting into dangerous territory. A worker's life is in peril at 99 degrees. Okay, next slide, please. So to avoid working while the sun is up, farm owners have shifted farm workers' schedules. This is a move that prioritizes their profits, not the people working with the crops. So workers are starting, workers' shifts are starting at night or early morning. So either they start their workday at 11 p.m. or they start it at 2 a.m. And you know that this is prioritizing the crops and not the people, because you're working in complete darkness. And that is not an hour of day that is easy to be working. So working at odd hours, being fatigued, working in the dark, and then working on ladders and tractors is not safe. And then in an interview, there's a farm worker, her name is Alidia, who picks apples at a farm near Benton City. She pointed out that it's really hard when you're working in the dark to see snakes and spiders. And we do have dangerous spiders. I'm personally not sure of the status of snakes here, but regardless, I wouldn't want snakes on me or near me. And you can't see it if you're working at night and in all of these crops. And both the, so there's the fear of what's in the dark, but then also the fear of going home, because farm owners do say that if it's too risky, you can go home. And Lydia has also worked through ash coming down on her and the crops, working through smoke that was thick, she could hardly see. You're breathing all of that in, it's damaging your health. And farm owners do say, you can go home if it's too risky, but one, like there's no guaranteed income if you're not working, but also the fact that she and others have experienced, like, okay, they say we can go home, we do go home, but then next time anything happens, they're the first to get cut, because to the owners, they're the ones who bailed and they're going to be replaced. So that's another consideration when it comes to shifting the schedule. Just because it's not so hot, that doesn't mean there aren't other dangers. Okay, next slide, please. And then there's more of the night. And then next slide. Okay, so there is the fact that heat-related deaths are entirely preventable. We know what causes them. We know how to prevent it from happening. It's a matter of farm owners, and they believe they're doing enough to protect workers, as well as legislative people making proactive, not reactive actions to truly protect farm workers. Next slide, please. And then there are little tiny movements to get farm workers better protections. So one of which is a 16-member agricultural compliance unit, and they were launched to perform worksite inspections and investigate safety complaints. And the good thing is that they do outreach and education with Spanish and English language materials that they give to the employees, but as well as the farms, so the farms can post in the language of the people working there. However, 16 members are very small. And again, this is more reactive. So people are going to have to report their bosses in order for them to start investigating. And unfortunately, because of the way this industry in Washington is set up, people are afraid to do so, even if they do have rights and do have protections, because losing their a day to go do this, or potentially it being, led back to them, that risks their job. So we've yet to see how successful the agricultural compliance unit will be in actually helping workers, but they are a good first step. Other steps are supporting nonprofits such as Community to Community, which is a very small nonprofit, and helping them do more outreach and more educational programming on workers' rights as a way to try and make huge change in an industry that has an incredibly long history of oppressing people and abusing them essentially to get the job done and make huge profits. And as you saw, billions of dollars in this industry, they get paid per cherry. And we need to, make different moves to help them. Earth Ministry, we acknowledge this. We love this. This is a great topic. We will navigate that as we see fit, but unfortunately, we don't have any current advocacy actions for anyone to take. But if you want to reach out to me, my email will be at the end, and I can divert you wherever your attention would like to go. And next slide. Okay, and now we have Jess, who is going to take us into Whatcom County.
Thank you, Kia. I'm reflecting on how what you shared aligns with some of the advocacy we do around climate justice, and how that applies into agriculture. So like you said, it's not as a direct campaign issue area that we're working on, but it's so important to understand this reality experienced by the farm worker community in our state. And we're grateful to be in coalition spaces with organizations that are bringing that voice forward as we're looking at what a just transition looks like as we do face more extreme climate conditions. I don't know about you all, but I feel tense in my shoulders just absorbing all of this all. So before I present on our last section, I'm just going to invite you to do whatever you need to release some tension from your body potentially. So for me, I'm going to roll my shoulders a few times because I was catching myself getting really kind of tense and grumpy about learning this information. Maybe deep breaths are for you. Maybe you want to stand up and move a bit. Do what you need to help process and maintain attention as we're taking in a lot in this teach-in. Okay, so our final focus area is around tribal treaty rights and how the faith community has been standing alongside Native nations. And we're going to look specifically, mostly at our relationship with Lummi Nation, and they are in Whatcom County, along with other members of the Coast Salish peoples, the Semiahmoo, and the Nooksack tribes. And we'll go to our next slide. So when requested, which is incredibly important, the framework of responding to requests for assistance, Earth Ministry WAIPL steps in to follow the leadership of Northwest Native nations and engage our faith community in Indigenous-led campaigns to protect treaty rights, fishing areas, sacred sites, and ways of life. Next slide. And it's rather unfortunate, the reason why we have to do so much of this work. So Indigenous peoples have been stewards of different regions across our state since time immemorial. It's really a framework that's hard for a settler descendant to wrap their mind around, the longevity of stewardship from the Native nations that continue to practice their traditional ways today. And in the 1850s, we saw treaties being established, and their intent was to be the supreme law of the land. So really establishing sovereignty and government-to-government relations. That's what fulfilling treaties would look like. When I say their intent, their intent upon creation was to seize land and power from Native peoples, and those promises we have seen repeatedly not upheld, and to this day treaty rights are not at the level that they are supposed to be as supreme law. And we see how Native spiritual practice and cultural identity are irrevocably harmed by environmental degradation. So the connection to Earth and the relationship with Earth that is inherent within the many different Native cultures across the region, it's so interconnected that when we're talking about these environmental issues of pollution, resource extraction, it's just so directly connected to this piece of culture and spirituality practiced by tribes. Next slide. So I'm gonna give you a few examples of how we've seen the validity of treaties not being respected, and how we've responded. So you might know, if you've been hanging out with Earth Ministry WAIPL for a while, that one of our really pivotal steps towards Native solidarity was when we were approached to help the Lummi Nation halt what would have been the world's largest coal export facility on their sacred lands and waters at Cuchiachin. And this is Cherry Point, so up north along the water towards the border with Canada. And it took 5 years, 5 really long years, and 5 years of tribal leadership, tribal council repeatedly saying no, and very firm documentation to the Army Corps of Engineers and the permitting agencies, and them receiving a response that's like, oh, thank you for your thoughts. We're gonna carry on now. And then they're like, no, no means no, right? So the leaders at some leaders at Lummi Nation approached Earth Ministry asking us specifically for faith community support in bringing a moral voice into backing up their no. And so we can go to the next slide here. what they brought forward is a really important document that is a letter of apology from Northwest Christian leaders to Native nations. This is on Earth Ministries WAIPL's website under our Indigenous Solidarity page, but it was a letter from 1987 that was affirmed again in 97, and then Earth Ministry facilitated a version of it in 2014 that's specific to fossil fuels. But what the letter does is name the egregious wrongdoings of the Christian church to the Native peoples across the region, apologize with humility, and pledge support moving forward. And that was, a promise that was made in 87. And as many documents do, they sit. And leader Jewel James, who is the master carver with the House of Tears carvers, brought this letter to Earth Ministry and said, "Hey, this promise was made. We're calling you out on it. We need your support." So that's what called us into this work initially, was wanting to stay true to that promise and help the faith community fulfill what we said we would do. And that includes advocacy. It's especially named in the letter of apology, which I think is important. And one way that I do see a note in the chat about a Taurus squirrel in the top picture. This letter was specifically from the Christian community and addressing boarding schools and those unique colonizing efforts. But there's also reconciliation ongoing within the Jewish community, though not with this specific example. Okay, so totem pole journeys. Some of you might have been to totem pole journeys. This is an example of us showing up and offering different spaces for free at different faith communities to have blessings for the totem poles that have been carved by leaders at Lummi and taken throughout the region to raise awareness. And so this is a way that we showed up and followed the lead of the tribe, and we continue to. We've done this annually, and at the end of my bit here, you'll get to hear about this year's totem pole journey, which will be coming up in May. And ultimately, we did see victory with halting coal export at Kuchiachin. In 2016, the permits were denied by the Army Corps of Engineers on the basis of Lummi treaty rights, specifically naming their right to fish and the adverse impacts on their way of life. Okay, we'll go to our next. So the next piece I want to bring forward is around orca recovery. So Earth Ministry and WAIPL is proud to partner with Sacred Sea. They are a nonprofit led by members of Lummi Nation who are committed to protecting life, sacred sites, and cultures of the Salish Sea. And they're currently focused on bringing home their relatives, Skalichuktanat. So in Lummi culture, orca are Koholmachin, and that is the relatives under the waves. So it's really a relationship of family. We'll go to the next slide. And heartbreakingly, Skalichuktanat was one of 45 southern resident orcas that were captured from the Salish Sea in 1970. She is still held at the Miami Seaquarium and has been there for 52 years. She lives in the smallest orca enclosure in the world. It is a concrete tank. It's 20 feet deep, and she's 22 feet long. So it's not as deep as she is long, which is certainly not allowing for adequate diving. And she's not doing very well there, as one might expect. She still sings the song unique to her pod, and her mother is still alive, swimming in the Salish Sea with remaining 32 L-pod orcas. So she knows who she is and where she belongs. And leaders at Lummi Nation and Sacred Sea have been hard at work to bring Scala Chectanat home, and are, I'm wondering if this is the next slide. Apologies. We'll hear more about what they're doing currently, but the next slide, I wanted to pause because I think sometimes we talk about environmental justice issues when we're not a member of that community or culture, and it's so important to create space to hear the voice of leaders who are within. So we have a really short video that speaks to relationship with orca, and that's on our next slide. And it's from the late hereditary chief, Bill James from Lummi, and the video was produced by our friend Freddie Lane, who we've worked with in other capacities as well.
I was raised with lots of old people. I knew lots of old people in my day, and they talked about Quilflaumachten. Achansasan, it's a Flamichasan Kalat. Gansa Salo, Quanasana Tachel, Tlatsana Talk. He Achansasan Huyam, it's a Quilflaumachten. Chaskano, he's Chashuyam, it's a Flami. An elder came to my house. He came right in, he sat down. I come to tell you a story of your people. And he said, you remember this now, the story of Quilflaumachten, the blackfish or the killer whale. And it's a long story, but they come from the people that live under the water. And a young man went down and he saw the people that lived under the water. But everything in creation are all our brothers and sisters and our relatives. That's why we have to respect everything. That's why we give thanks to everything that we eat, everything that we do, because we all know that they come from people at one time, and they're our relatives. Quilflaumachten was taken away off to Florida, and it's kind of like our people. When the government and the church came in, they took our children away to parochial and government schools. And they tried to take away our culture, our history, our language, our values, and our families. So she's in the same situation as our people. She has that, like he's saying, that historical trauma that we all live through and that we all carry every day. But we need to strive to maintain our identity as to who we are as a people and how we're related to Quilflaumachten. I really feel bad for her. I watched the video as she cries. Really makes you feel bad to see her crying to come home. All we're trying to do is help her. It's not only Lummi Nation that's fighting to get her back. There's a lot of other people that are helping all along the way. They're willing to step forward and help get her here. So, with these few words, I just wanted to share with you, Aishka.
Thank you. And we honor the memory of Bill James and his shared wisdom living on. So Scully Chucktanot needs to be with her family to swim in the waters of the Salish Sea and be cared for with love by her relatives above the water. Lummi Nation and Sacred Sea are doing really good work preparing a place for her return. A lawsuit has been underway invoking the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which is something that it's a law that requires return of sacred objects and cultural items that were removed from tribes. So the Earth Law Center is representing the case. The Whale Sanctuary Project is currently drafting up a very comprehensive plan for how we could bring Scully Chucktanot back to the waters of the Salish Sea, not just dumping her and saying good luck, but caring for her, having an enclosure that is spacious and natural, where her family can connect with her, and where Lummi leaders can care for her. So they are currently raising funds for this effort, and I'm going to see if one of the other staff can copy this link into the chat box for us, but we encourage you to contribute so that hopefully when the time does come, there will be adequate funding to help bring this space to reality. Okay. And then last but not least, we have the salmon, which are what feed orcas. And like Maddie was saying at, we can go to the next slide, but like Maddie was saying at the beginning of the presentation, we do hour-long workshops on just one of these many specific issues. So there's certainly more nuance than I'm able to speak to in this short time, but I do want to name how salmon are at the heart of Northwest Native tribes' cultures, diets, economies, and they have been since time immemorial. And I was really moved by this statement that comes from a document from the Northwest Tribal Salmon Alliance calling on Congress to act in meaningful salmon recovery on the lower Snake River. They say that salmon are inseparable from who we are. We exist because salmon exist. They are our food, ceremony, culture, and the very heart of our economy and lifeway. Even as our ancestors' lives and homelands were threatened, they made sure to protect within the treaties our ancestral salmon lifeway. Those treaties were promises made by the United States governments, and those promises must be kept. Next slide. So treaties not only secured tribes' reservation land, but also the right to take fish in common with, is the wording used, settlers at usual and accustomed off-reservation locations. And so this was interpreted loosely throughout the years, and there were a whole series of very heated, what we call fishing wars in the Northwest around interpreting this that led to the legal case and decision of Judge Bolt in 1974. And the Bolt decision was really monumental because it established tribal co-management of salmon and steelhead fisheries, and it granted tribes 50% of the harvestable number of fish in their usual and accustomed fishing grounds. So when we see poor management of salmon runs at the hands of the United States government, that is breaking our treaty promises to Native nations who are have a legal right as well as their inherent right to abundance of 50% of the catch in these spaces and at numbers that are far above where they are now. We'll go to the next slide. And so a big source of our salmon crisis is the decline in lower Snake River salmon and steelhead, where all four populations are listed as threatened of extinction. And that has a cascading impact on the treaty fishing rights of all Northwest Native nations. And so I know we started this talking about Whatcom County. This is a topic that Lummi Nation has been outspoken on and try to draw attention to how it is a full state, really a regional issue, because the salmon are the lifeblood that connect us all from west to east, or east to west and back again. So Earth Ministry and Washington Interfaith Power and Light is advocating for a holistic solution, a comprehensive approach that really can look towards what it would be like to have a free-flowing Lower Snake River to replace the energy provided, the very small amount of energy provided by the 4 dams on the Lower Snake River. So we're just looking at that section, not the entire Columbia system. And seeing that as the science has proven to be the primary way that we could recover salmon, and wanting to do that in a way that keeps communities whole. Is really, really important to us. And we think the faith community has a unique role to play in articulating this nuance of the approach of ensuring the well-being of all in the revitalization of communities and investments in infrastructure, so that we can see the return of abundant salmon, and in so doing fulfill our treaty promises. And go to our last slide, because this is not the last you will hear about our work on salmon recovery. That is going to be the focus of our faithful advocacy this spring. So we are awaiting a really monumental report from Senator Murray and Governor Inslee, who are studying how to feasibly replace the services provided by those dams so that we can see salmon recover. So there is going to be a public comment period on the draft of that report coming up in May. And you can sure bet you'll be hearing from me asking you to help us raise up a voice for comprehensive solutions that fulfill treaties. And then Lummi Nation is embarking on another totem pole journey focused specifically around Lower Snake River salmon recovery. So this is the save the date, and we will be sending an email out to our community shortly here in the next few weeks. But I want to draw your attention to the events that we're particularly involved in. May 3rd, Bellingham. This is going to be hosted by the Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship, who are great allies of Lummi Nation. And then May 19th is the Seattle stop, and that will be at the University of Washington Longhouse. And May 20th, the Tacoma stop, the very last one. Earth Ministry WAIPL is actually the lead nonprofit supporting that event, and it's going to be hosted at St. Leo's Catholic Church in Tacoma. So we would love to see you there, and you'll be hearing much more from us about these opportunities. Okay, so with that, I am going to turn it over to Lindsay, who is going to bring us home. And oh my gosh, I have a whole slide I forgot. Y'all, there's just so much. Okay, just briefly. This is kind of a summary of ways that we can take action to right the wrongs, certainly fulfilling our treaty promises. Good consultation with free, prior, and informed consent is important. There's a new law or new policy in place through the Centennial Accord that requires this as of 2019, but we do need to hold our electeds accountable. I once heard a Native leader pointing to every person in the crowd who is a US citizen and said, this treaty is for you to uphold. So we, it's not just something that those we put in office are to do, but we are to hold them accountable for. And then there's many ways the faith community can show up in solidarity, repudiating the doctrine of discovery, which is a long-held Christian theological teaching allowing for colonization of indigenous territory, upholding those promises in the letter of apology we mentioned, practicing genuine land acknowledgements and really taking those seriously, and then responding to any requests. So, okay, now what I was saying, we're going to turn it over to Lindsay for just a really brief closing us out today with just rooting us back into our various different spiritual traditions, and hoping that you can find your grounding in that to carry forward this important work for environmental justice. We might go just a couple minutes over, so we encourage you to stick around with us to see this part through. Thanks for your flexibility and understanding.
Yeah, thank you, Jess. That was a great section on respecting treaty rights. And I apologize if you hear any cheering or clapping in the background. There's some folks in the room over celebrating some very exciting milestones. So grace for them. So I just wanted to talk about how all of our faith traditions in the world have values that can speak to a call to environmental justice. Obviously, I'm not going to be covering all of those values or all of the traditions that exist in the world, but I just wanted to give us a little taste of what that might look like. And here on the slide, you can see some snippets of ideas of what might inspire a call to environmental justice in some of these faith traditions. And I'm just going to pull a few since we have limited time, but in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, there is a common tenet of the faith that God created the people to be caretakers of the earth. Now, in Islam, that word is khalifa, which is saying that you are an agent of God to care for the earth. In Judaism, there's the idea of shomrei. I'm sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this. Shomrei Adama, and in Christianity, there's, in any language, lots of different words, but basic idea, we use that word of stewardship a lot in Christianity. And so those are common to those three faiths. Now in Buddhism, there's an idea, that first one called Paticca Samuppada, which can be translated to mean dependent origination. Some people might call that interconnectedness or interbeing. Some of these ideas that you might share in your own faith, that you have different words for, or different texts that support this, but a lot of us have these ideas that we have a common responsibility to creation, to care for each other, and there are a lot of calls for justice as well. In Buddhism, it's a call to relieve suffering, to have compassion on all sentient beings. In Christianity, to love thy neighbor, to care for the least of these. In Islam, it's called adl, which means justice. And God created the world for justice in that conception. In Judaism, there's an idea of tzedek, also can mean justice along with righteousness. So many other descriptions of that one word. And in Sikhism, there's an idea of having harmony with all beings in the world, to have compassion and fight for justice. There's so many dimensions that we can discover in our own faith traditions that point to these values that we've talked about. I'm going to share some links in the chat so you can discover a little bit more about what this might look like in your own faith tradition. This first one is going to be from actually the UN Environmental Program's Faith for Earth action, and it's a long document with a long link, but you're going to find some great stuff in there, including some prayers, some hymns. There's all kinds of things that you can find for different faiths. And this is a document from Interfaith Power and Light, our national affiliate, where you can find different statements that other faith traditions have released on what their call is in response to climate change and what that means specifically to them and how they're going to take action. So I encourage you to look into those documents and see what that might mean for your tradition, or be inspired by something of another tradition that you don't call your own. And then I'll leave it at that for now to keep us in line with our time. I know I'm just a minute over our hopeful end, but yeah, I just wanted to leave us with a connection to the source of why we choose to be engaged in this work. And for so many of us in the Earth Ministry community, that is our faith. And that is what drives us to work against these injustices. Oh, Christianity is misspelled on that slide. Sorry about that. That's my fault. And I want to end by just saying, if anybody has any questions, you go to the next slide, Maddie. Feel free to email. Kia is going to be a lead on this one. You can email Kia at earthministry.org. You could also email me, lindsay@earthministry.org. All of our emails are listed on the Earth Ministry website, and you can find a lot more resources on there.